class. We'll have a couple of other Zoom sessions later in the semester, but those will be synchronous and held on Wednesday evenings. Um, that being said, there is some additional background and another recording on, or I'm sorry, available to you on Canvas that I will mention again below. And that's strictly if you like it. It's optional. It provides a little bit more background on public economics and public policy, but it's not required. So my goal in this video real quick is just to show you the course's Canvas page to walk through the basics of the syllabus, requirements, assessment, etc. And then just to provide you a little bit of more context about the nature of the class. So turning first to the class's Canvas page, which is now available to you all. The key things here to note are the easiest way to contact me is via email. The university has expressed of the executive MBA program, but I'm very flexible. This is the only class I'm teaching this semester, and I'm happy to meet whenever, whether that be in person, over the phone, or via Zoom. If you take a look at the course's Canvas page, and as I mentioned in the email that this recording link went out with, I would like you to do this before our first class. You'll have some info here on the nature of the class, its goals, and then importantly, as you scroll down to the requirements and assessment. The assessment here, first of all, is pretty standard inclusion of attendance and participation. There's also some details on how I will grade that for our class days. There are a set of exercises that you'll complete in your study team that will build up to a final presentation and slide deck that you will submit. And that's those two alone are 35% of your grade. Another aspect of this class is that it covers ethics. So you will also do an interview in pairs later in the semester once we reach the ethics content. And then lastly, as part of our residency in DC, in addition to meeting with guest speakers and policymakers, et cetera, we will do a crisis management simulation because the non-market environment of the firm, that is the political, social, and legal environment of the firm, is often the source of crises. So we also cover that material here. One note is for all of the work that's done in teams, whether that's a random team or your study team, you will also be, or I also implement peer grading there to foster a sense of accountability. So on those larger assignments where teams are involved, roughly 80% of the grade I will determine and 20% will be determined by your teammates. So as you scroll further down to the bottom, you'll get into the day-to-day content here in the course summary. So for example, this first date of Wednesday, August 20th covers the material I'd like you to watch ahead of class. So this video will be linked there. Then there's the background video that you have access to if you want. That is optional. You'll have access to the slides I'm going to go over in this asynchronous lecture. And then the first reading here is one I would like you to complete as part of your prep material ahead of, or as part of watching this video, really. If you go back, more importantly, if you look at our first two class dates, so example here, or for example here, August 21st, you'll see there that ahead of class, I will post the slides, or I will note if they will be updated after class. For example, when we do case discussions, I don't post slides related to those until after we've discussed the case. But you also see here, here's the reading I would like you to complete for our first in-person class on August 21st. Note also that in all of these instances, there will be some questions here. You do not submit anything. And in fact, for ahead of our first two classes of the 21st and 23rd of August, you will not submit anything. You'll just complete the readings ahead of time. So these questions are there just to guide your reading. You don't have to turn anything in. So that's about it in terms of the sorts of background material and logistical material. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. I will talk more in depth about the main assignments when we meet in person, but all of them are already linked here on Canvas, so you can get a sense of what's going to be required of you over the course of the semester. In addition, down here on the calendar, you'll see that we have classes denoted, but also the deliverables. So you could also look to this to get a sense of when major assignments are going to be due, and as well as our trip to DC and the assignments that will be due after that, which are kind of the capstone for our semester. So as I mentioned, please look over all of this. Also, be brainstorming about a public policy issue that you might be interested in working on over the course of the semester in your study team. One of the things we'll try and do during the first 2 class days, and you'll see here is due on Saturday, August 23rd at midnight. Don't worry, this is only going to involve a sentence or 2 on your part in your study teams, is choosing a client firm and a public policy issue for which you're going to want to develop a presentation and slide deck for over the course of the semester. So let me turn away from Canvas real quick and just say that the objective for this first video then, or the remainder of you are at the whim of governmental institutions in the non-market. So you might try and influence what public policy is being adopted, strategically engaging to do so. But ultimately, when the government decides on public policy, that is the law of the land, and they have coercive force to involve that. So this environment, the non-market environment, is just as, if not more competitive than the market environment, because in addition to all of your market competitors, all of those other actors in that earlier diagram are present and trying to shape public policy. That being said, one of the things that's kind of unique about things here like environment today, and it's semester and year develop a presentation and slide deck for over the course of the semester. So let me turn away from Canvas real quick and just say that the objective for this first video then, or the remainder of this first video then, is to provide you background on the overall topic of the class, which you can think of as legal and regulatory risk or social and political risk, or what we call it in academia, which is kind of the non-market environment of the firm. So let me pull up slides for that part real quick. All right, so as I said before, these slides will be downloadable. All the slides for class will be downloadable over the course of the semester. If it's just lecture or discussion, general discussion, those slides will be available ahead of class. If it's a case discussion, those slides will be available after class. So as I said, the goal is to talk to you a little bit about the non-market environment of the firm today and its relationship to the market environment of the firm. So the non-market environment of the firm can involve a lot of things, but we typically conceptualize it as involving legal, regulatory, political, and social risks that firms face, along with their corresponding public policy issues and the policy making on those issues. So why do we care about this, right? You're thinking, well, that sounds like political science or political economy, but not really something I should be thinking about in the business school world. So today, one of my goals is to pitch this topic to you, but I also think maybe living in the real world over the last decade has probably done that. So I'm going to inject a little bit of academic content as well. So why do we care about all of this? Well, in reality, as opposed to theory, in particular kind of classic economic theory, there's no such thing as a pre-political marketplace, not in the real world, right? The way of thinking about that is that political actors construct and govern all of the markets. There's essentially no market in the world currently that is completely free of government intervention. Or if it is, that's by a choice of governments to leave it unregulated. Why is this important? Well, what that means is that it's an arena then, the structure of the market itself, in which firms can engage in strategy and shaping the environment in which they operate. That is, that regulatory, legal, political outcomes, etc., unlike things like, say, the weather or even pandemics, really, are not exogenous to firms. In fact, they're endogenous, that firms play a large role in constructing the regulations under which they operate. Another way of thinking about that is that firms are social and political actors just as much as they are economic actors. And this goes from the largest of businesses down to a single entrepreneur run firm. So what that means then is that this broader environment, the social, legal, political, regulatory environment, can create constraints on firm and industry behavior. So think here the traditional way we think about regulations, but they can also create opportunities for value creation and kind of the good way of thinking about this. And in some senses, it's also kind of the dark side of this is that they can create opportunities for value capture, where, say, you as an incumbent firm can shut out competition and accrue a bunch of rents or surplus value that might not accrue to you in a market that was characterized by perfect competition. So let's unpack this a little bit further. What are some of the constraints? Well, there's legislation and regulation. One form that can take is what we call market design, which is just establishing the rules by which markets operate. And that is kind of the classic version of regulation. It's often industry specific. So think here about things like securities laws, for example, and how they govern the financial industry. More broadly, we can also think about social regulation. So here are policies that extend across all economic actors. So this is a category of regulation that really started to grow in the 1960s and 1970s in the US context. So think about things here like environmental or occupational safety and health regulations. Third is taxation, which I'm sure you were all familiar with as individuals, but also is really important for firms and industries as well. Fourth is trade policy. Again, a topic that even over the last 12 hours, I don't have to say much about in terms of how it can impact firms. But there are also, other constraints that can be introduced by this environment. So one is corruption, right? So that is, in particular, in developing economies where you have to worry about violating things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the Anti-Bribery Act in the UK. And corruption we typically think of as public officials using their office for private gain. So think here about things like grease payments or bribes, and the ethical questions that arise when you're doing businesses in cultures or political economies where that's the norm. But even in what we would think of as advanced industrial democracies like the US or France or anywhere in the EU, you have to worry about what we would call rent extraction, right? So oftentimes we think about how firms might use the government to their own benefit, but it might also be the case that the government is extracting from firms some of their surplus value to the benefit of the government, to the benefit of individual politicians, et cetera. So that could be a very large downside risk to engaging in this realm. All that said, right, the government does provide a lot of good things for business. At its most base, it provides property rights, right? So if you think about any contract you engage in, any asset you own, that's because there are well-established property rights. And then contracts, which are backed up by courts, which are part of the government, allow for the exchange of those property rights. So absent a kind of neutral third party like the government, it's unclear who would secure those rights and who would facilitate their transfer. And I should say those two things are essential to the functioning of a capitalist economy. Just as legislation and regulation can cause constraints for firms, they can also produce opportunities. So imagine you work in the green energy sector. The passage of the IRA, right, the Inflation Reduction Act, would have been a boon for you, as it was really kind of a bill that was designed to incentivize both corporate and individual investment in green energy. While that has subsequently largely been repealed by the Big Beautiful Bill, for at least a few years, that created a lot of opportunities for individuals and firms in that sector. A third opportunity is just to think about it on a purely pecuniary business. Nobody spends more money than the government. So through the contracting process, both in the defense sector, but more broadly, provides lots of opportunities for top line or revenue growth for individual firms should you become a government contractor. A fourth, and this kind of echoes back to the example of the Inflation Reduction Act, is that sometimes the government just straight up engages in industrial policy or subsidization of particular industries. So that was true in the green energy sector. And while some of that has been repealed, other things that have occurred in the last few years that have that kind of sense of industrial policy have continued. So, for example, the CHIPS Act, which was designed to onshore a lot of semiconductor manufacturing, passed under the Biden administration, and still remains in place today, right? And that's incentivizing the building of new semiconductor fabs in places like Arizona, here just outside of Austin, Ohio, New York, etc. And that is a decision being made by the government, right, for national security purposes, largely to directly invest in these industries or directly subsidize these industries in a way that they don't in other places, but that makes it economically feasible for large semiconductor firms like TSMC or Samsung to build plants or fabs here in the United States. And then perhaps more controversially, a lot of engagement in the social, political, regulatory realm can be thought of as brand positioning as well. This is a much newer phenomenon, right? Really something that's only started in the last 15 years or so, has been caught up in different social movements. You can think about this as the woke wave versus the anti-woke backlash, and different firms, especially smaller firms, not really large publicly traded firms, but different firms kind of staking out different socio-political terrain and attaching that to their brand, and appealing to specific market segments and using that as a way of differentiating kind of in our polarized political economy here in the United States. So why does this all matter? Another way of thinking about this is that the government governs growth opportunities for firms and industries. We've seen that recently with green tech, but we can see that now with how firms that are reliant on supply chains abroad might be facing much bigger challenges currently and in the next few years than those that do most of their sourcing domestically, or are not manufacturing firms even, or selling manufactured products. Another way of thinking about it, though, and this is more my preferred way, is thinking about in terms of why firms should engage in any of this, is thinking about it as kind of a form of insurance or risk management, both vis-a-vis what the government might do to you, but more broadly in the social environment, thinking about challenges you might face from things like social movements, non-governmental organizations, etc. Not only is this not only are some aspects of the non-market environment opportunities, but we really do have to think about it as a source of risk and how you might manage that risk. In a similar vein, you can also think about kind of continuing investment in this area as a form of kind of a real option. That is ensuring that you have a seat at the table whenever your public policy issue of concern might come up. And to give you a sense of how much this might matter is that a recent survey that was done of S&P 500 CEOs found that on average, they're spending at least an hour a day on political and non-market issues and making something like 3 trips to DC or state capitals a year. So they're all reporting that they're doing much more in this realm than they ever have before, right? And it's becoming much more central to the role that executives and people at the executive level and above have to play within their organizations and outside of their organizations. So what are some kind of more concrete examples of this from the last few years? So one from today, as I'm getting ready to record this lecture, right, President Trump is currently putting pressure on the CEO of Intel to resign. If you move to the lower left corner, over the last year, we've also had this continuing saga about whether or not TikTok will be banned in the United States. In the upper right-hand corner, just to show you that this is not just a recent phenomenon, but one that plays out all the time. If we go back to the prior administration under President Biden, right, they initially had issued a employee mandate at the height of the pandemic as vaccines were rolling out against COVID for all businesses, which the Supreme Court then overturned, but maintained for particular industries, for example, in the healthcare space. In the lower right-hand corner, you can also think about just the true legal risks that individual executives at firms face. Under the Biden administration, the Department of Justice was much less likely to exercise prosecutorial discretion. And a really great example of the degree of enforcement, then, you could turn to Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos in the prison sentence she's currently serving, actually just outside of Boston. And while these are all kind of pretty serious and dramatic examples, I also included just one kind of funny one. This dates back a little bit further to the Obama administration, but you may not have known this, but till about 2016, uh, what was considered French dressing in the United States was actually very highly regulated. And the FDA only got rid of that regulation, allowing for more flexibility in the interpretation of French dressing in the consumer packaged good segment. Uh, and now there's more room for experimentation, I guess. Um, and while that might seem silly, you can imagine for some small businesses that might be something that matters to them, right? And creates new market opportunities for them. All right. So, all of that being said, turning back to kind of the more serious content here, one of the first things I want you to take away from this topic or thinking about this concept of the non-market environment is that the degree to which it matters for firms and the need to which have to engage in strategizing on it is actually pretty tightly correlated with the degree to which the government already regulates the industry or is already intervening in the industry, right? So, on the upper left-hand corner of this chart, you would see your kind of classic regulated utilities. So something like landline telephones, to the degree that they still exist, they're actually very heavily regulated. So a firm like that, or even think back a couple of years ago to your traditional regulated electric utility, those are the kinds of businesses in which the government actually determined the rate of return on investments in capital investments or capital expenditures, et cetera. Um, so that's a case in which it's of extreme importance, right? As we move further to the right and lower down in this diagram, industries where there is far less government intervention, at least historically, but it's really, say, think about like consumer electronics that are sort of commoditized. This sort of stuff is far less important, right? So another way of thinking about this then is that kind of no firm should engage in this for its own sake. And I think that's a lesson that a lot of companies and industries have learned in the last 2 years, but rather should only kind of engage in social and political or in the social and political environment when it is a complement to their market strategy or reinforces their market strategy. So a really great example I've gotten from a friend who works in this space involves Nestle. And what they have is what they call a kind of a materiality index for social and political issues. So for them, they have two dimensions to this. One, the vertical is stakeholder interests, and the other on the horizontal is the impact on the firm itself. And they kind of bucket different issues market strategy. So a really great example I've gotten from a friend who works in this space involves Nestle. And what they have is what they call a kind of a materiality index for social and political issues. So for them, they have two dimensions to this. One, the vertical is stakeholder interests, and the other on the horizontal is the impact on the firm itself. And they kind of bucket different issues into these different zones. And it's only those that really fall into that upper right-hand corner where they know their stakeholders. So investors, employees, consumers, parts of their supply chain, et cetera, have high interest in the issue, and that it has the potential to have significant impact on the firm's performance that they really engage. So perhaps unsurprisingly for a company like Nestle, you will see things like nutrition, water, responsible marketing, and food and product safety as being the sort of public policy issues that they're always engaged on. Whereas by contrast, more generic categories of employee safety or fair employment and youth employment, the employability are not issues that they would engage on. So let's move away then from kind of these examples to kind of introducing some more systematic thinking about this topic. So as I mentioned earlier, when we think about what the non-market environment is, we typically define it as the social, legal, and political environment of the firm and all the relationships that exist within those environments. So another way of thinking about that graphically is to think about your firm or any company in the center of this diagram, and then think about what we primarily teach you in the business school, which is this first concentric circle of managing your customers, your competitors, and your suppliers. What the non-market environment is this outer concentric circle that encompasses the first two circles, right? So within that, you have NGOs, you have individuals not in their role as consumers, but as citizens. You have governments. Within the government, you have regulators. And then you have other outside actors like the media that frame issues and how they're discussed and how firms are responding to them. And even individual agitators or activists. And think here, historically, someone like Ralph Nader, for example. So as I mentioned, the non-market environment is the social, legal, and political environment. And as a subset of legal, we typically would throw in regulatory as well. What's important about it is that in contrast to the market environment, challenges arise from the public sphere, right? So not just from your competitors. These challenges can be voluntary, right? So sometimes firms will want to enter into or engage on a particular issue, and they will just decide that that's what they want to do. Maybe it's due to a change in market strategy. Maybe it's due to the preferences of the CEO. But there can also be involuntary, right? Where a firm is targeted by an activist, is targeted by a social movement, is targeted by a politician, like the example involving President Trump and Intel just a moment ago. These challenges, importantly, are mediated by institutions. So here, think about formal decision-making bodies of the state and not the marketplace. So a way of thinking about that is that, institutions have particular structures and rules, and the people who sit inside them have a particular set of incentives. And that can be very different than the players in a marketplace, right? So a way of thinking about that is that, in the marketplace, the exchange is governed by agreements and contracts. These exchanges are typically voluntary and involve property, whereas none of that might be true in the non-market sphere, right? So you don't have to come to an agreement in the non-market environment for something to happen to you, right? Or so by contrast to, say, engaging with a counterparty, agreeing on a contract after some negotiation and voluntarily signing that, you are at the whim of governmental institutions in the non-market. So you might try and influence what public policy is being adopted, strategically engaging to do so. But ultimately, when the government decides on public policy, that is the law of the land, and they have coercive force to involve that. So this environment, the non-market environment, is just as, if not more competitive than the market environment, because in addition to all of your market competitors, all of those other actors in that earlier diagram are present and trying to shape public policy. That being said, one of the things that's kind of unique, or I guess very different is a better way of putting it, from the market environment is in the marketplace, cooperating with your competitors is generally frowned upon, or you have to be very careful when you're doing it not to raise the specter of collusion or price fixing. In contrast, in the non-market environment, cooperation among competitors is allowed. And this is often a source of tremendous competitive advantage for business versus other interests, because typically, even though you are competing against these other firms in the marketplace, your interests in the non-market environment are often they often have a lot in common, and the stakes are often the same and often very large for you all. So ultimately, I think a key distinction here, and I alluded to this just a moment ago, is that once the governmental institutions decide to do something, they have a monopoly on coercion to enforce their decisions. right? So think back to a market exchange, you agree with the counterparty and you sign a contract. Well, who enforces that contract? The courts, the government, the state, right? And again, that's because they have that coercive force. In the non-market environment, they can enforce what they want to or what they decide upon, and it's their decision as to what that is. So non-market strategy then is an attempt to influence those decisions to make sure that whatever public policy is adopted by the government is one that is at least as as does as little harm to your industry as possible, if not on the flip side, provides some benefit to your industry. So overall, I would describe the non-market environment as not uniform, not predictable. I think the difference in policymaking that we've seen the last 6 months versus the prior 4 years reflects that, and not just because we have presidents of different parties in charge. We have presidents who have just kind of fundamentally different approaches to policymaking, period, right? Which make things a bit more or a bit less predictable now than they were, say, even 4 years ago, even if the direction is more advantageous for individual firms and industries. It's also true that outcomes here are much less certain and firms have less control. So even when the government, say, adopts a policy, whatever that policy might be, may have lots of unintended consequences, some of which might be beneficial, some of which might not. The government might also, like I was just saying, change in its composition, and certain policies might be enforced and certain policies might not. So even when you think things are maybe certain because there's a law that is passed, doesn't necessarily mean that is the case. So how am I going to argue that firms and you all in your roles, when you go back to these firms, engage strategically in this environment? Well, I think a key thing is obviously to be consistent. And a lot of firms, I think, are paying a price right now for being inconsistent over the last decade, but also adopting a long-term orientation, realizing that the people who sit in institutions will come and go. What you need to do is what is best for your firm, and what is best for your firm over the long haul, not in any one snapshot in time. So why do we focus on this topic at the executive level in our curriculum? Well, that's because managers and really executives, even above that, are the only individuals that have really the broad insights to their organizations in terms of market strategy to appreciate how the market environment in which they operate creates either situations in which they will stand to benefit or be harmed by the non-market environment. Similarly, they are the ones who can probably look at laws, regulations, etc., put it into the context of their existing business and think about how that business has to change, say, potentially to comply with that law, or what new non-market or what new market opportunities might be caused or created by changes in the non-market environment. So my goal then over the course is really to provide you with a set of frameworks and tools that you, as the individual sitting in the middle of this diagram, can use to make decisions about non-market strategy, to navigate all of this uncertainty, and to think about how you can manage legal, regulatory, social, political risk in a way that creates and sustains your competitive advantage in the marketplace, both in terms of voluntary engagement in that non-market environment and in terms of addressing challenges that might arise involuntarily. So what do I want you to take away from this relatively brief online lecture? Really remember that firms do play these social and political roles in addition to how we typically think about them as economic actors. Remember that the importance of all of this in terms of the non-market environment is going to be correlated with the degree to which the government affects the firm's market environment already. And in terms of goals then, for the course as a whole, what you're going to find out is that often firms are really bad at this. And what I want you to take away then is like, why is that the case? Why is it that so many cases that we discuss are actually going to be ones of failures, whether that be on a strategic level or an ethical level or both? And think about why it is that the firms or industries failed in these cases. But on the flip side, I want you to more importantly walk away from understanding how to do this right from both a strategic and an ethical perspective. And as a result, understand that actually doing this right, having a well-oiled non-market function within your organization, or one that you contract for even, is relatively immaterial in terms of its cost. And doing it well then is immaterial versus the significant costs there can be for failing. Most importantly, what I want you to understand is that successful companies understand that if they do not manage their non-market environment, it will manage them. Or the phrase that you will hear all the time when we're in Washington, D.C., is that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that that is only increasingly true in our current environment. So I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time, and digging into more of this, answering any questions you have about the syllabus, assessments, etc. And in the meantime, if anything arises that you want to talk to me about or need clarity on, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care and looking forward to it.